This conference will now be recorded.
Can we turn it over to Chris for any introductory remarks?
Sure, but before I do that, I'd like to turn it over to Tad for any introductory / conclusion remarks, I guess.
Sure, Chris. And I think many of you know that I am retiring literally a week from today. Those of you that have worked closely with me for multiple years know that I threatened to never retire until we attain all the federal air quality standards. And actually, for the first time in 2022, for the first time in Maryland's history,
yeah, I had to
we
find.
are finally meeting all of the national ambient air quality standards of the state, first time ever. So even ozone, now there's a new ozone standard coming. So
there's people that aren't muted that are online. Please mute your phone if you're not talking.
Thank you, John. So anyway, new ozone standard coming, so I got to retire quick. Now, I've worked with this council for a long time, and this is by far the best council we have ever had. And that does not mean it's the easiest council we've ever had, because to be honest with you, this council has really made MDE work. You ask hard questions, you drive a lot of good policy, and you know, as you know, I'm proud of the work that I do, and you all should be proud of the work that you do too, because between what MDE has pushed and between what you all have helped us move forward with, the air has gotten a lot cleaner. So I really appreciate this council and a lot of the friendships and the professional input I've gotten, and so it's been a great council. So even though air quality has improved dramatically, this council has some huge challenges ahead of it. I think the two big ones that you all know are climate change and environmental justice. And I think that our last meeting, we gave you a preview of some things we're working on in terms of environmental justice. And today, you're going to be dealing with probably the hottest topic across the country in terms of air quality, which is climate change. And this regulatory proposal that MDE is going to be showing you today, we've talked to you in the past about, is extremely important. And you will see more of these climate change driven regulatory actions over the next year. It is probably the hottest area, environmental justice right up near the top. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris. I really just wanted to thank you all for the work you've done and the success you've helped the state of Maryland achieve. And, you know, it's been a great long run. I mean, some of you I've been working with for literally 40 years. And that's a long time. So I really appreciate it. And I'm going to hand it off to Chris. I will tell you that the new management team taking over for the air and radiation group is amazing. Between Chris Hoagland, Megan Ulrich, and Angelo Bianco on the management side, you've got three of the best people doing air quality protection and climate change protection work in the country. And you ought to feel good about that. And our staff, even though we're smaller than we'd like to be, the people we have are really good. And so we have a powerful staff, maybe not as many as we'd like, and the management team you guys get to work with is great. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Chris. And I guess the last word is I just wanted to thank you all for all of the work you've done and the help you provided the state of Maryland and the citizens who breathe the air in terms of cleaning up the air. It's been a great long run. I appreciate it. Thanks. Chris, I'm going to hand it back to you.
I think we have time for an applause for Mr. Aburn. What a great career. What a great addition you have made to this state. We're all so proud of what we accomplished under your leadership. So thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, Tad. And following your example, Tad, we're now going to grab an extremely challenging and important issue right by the horns. The primary topic for today is methane emissions from landfills. It is absolutely critical, as you'll see later, that we reduce methane emissions in order to meet our climate goals and mitigate catastrophic climate change. So we'll be talking a lot about a proposed rule addressing methane from landfills, the largest source of methane in Maryland. And then we'll also update you all on the VEAP amendments that you considered some time ago. So with that, let's get started. John?
Can I just go back a little bit? We got
Sure
out
thing.
of order because we wanted to, so we haven't said hello and good morning from everyone. And the main thing I'd like to do, and maybe Kelsey or Randy could introduce the new Air Quality Control Advisory Council member. It's great to welcome them and let them say hi to everyone if we could.
Sure. Hi.
Hi.
I'm the new member. My name's Anna Marshall. I'm going to be representing BMC on the council, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you.
Well, thanks for joining us. It's so great. And I don't really have a sense. We have most council members on, Randy?
Yes, at count, I had 12 members. John, if you want to just let them introduce themselves quickly, that would be fine. We've got.
Yeah, I don't have access to see who's on. Is there any way you could lead us through that so to go efficiently?
Okay, I'm going to do my best. There are a few callers, so I may not have everyone, but I have Larry Schoen, Anna Marshall, Robert Wright, Zania Amir, Thomas Dernoga, Thomas Keeling, Weston Young, Nicole Cook, Megan Latshaw, John Quinn, of course, John Coombe, and Ross Salowich. And my apologies if I missed someone.
Did we miss anyone?
Todd Chasen is on.
Oh,
Hi, Todd. So normally how we work, and we just go through this, is we get presentations from staff or leadership, and then we have a discussion among the council, and then we always make room for public input after that. But the thing is to focus on the council discussions first, questions and answers with the council, and then expand it after that. Just a reminder of process. And sorry to jump in on all that, Chris. I sure appreciate it. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being part of the call. And I'll jump right to the minutes. And since I have something to do on the agenda today, did everyone get a chance to look at the minutes from last meeting?
Yes.
Yes.
Oh, great. I'll appreciate a motion to approve.
I move to approve. This is Sania.
Thank you. Who's the second?
I'll second.
All in favor? Say aye or wave.
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody opposed? I count that as the motion passed. Thank you. Our minutes are approved.
John, I'll abstain because I wasn't there, and also point out, was it really a valid meeting with both PEs absent?
Good point.
They always say that. That's it. That's what we have. And then we turn it back to you, Chris, or Mark Stewart for the next item.
Excellent. Yeah, I wonder, Randy, could you introduce us to the next topic? Yep, bring it up. And then we're joined by Mark Stewart, Program Manager of our Climate Change Program, who's going to join the REG staff today in presenting this REG proposal.
thank you, Chris and here. Finally, it's come up. So thank you, and presenting this topic. This has been something that's been long in the making. We've been working on this issue for quite some time now, but it is a new PROMAR regulation, the control of methane emissions from municipal solid waste landfills. Just a reminder to everyone, and let me get the slideshow going, is that this meeting is being recorded, and we do post the meeting information up on our MBE Air Quality Control Advisory Council website. And with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Eddie Durant. Eddie, would you like to walk through this one, or are we starting with Mark? Eddie, you may be on mute. Just double check, make sure I'm not controlling his.
Yeah, we're not hearing him, but I do see that he has a microphone live, unfortunately. So.
Yeah, there I see it as well. Yeah, I'm not keeping him going. Eddie, are you able to talk? Maybe switched it off. And then back on. You try again, Eddie?
We could also try a phone line if we need to.
Yeah.
And I think the next slide is the slide that Mark was presenting. So that'll give Eddie and I a minute to get the landfill regulation together. This is Carolyn Jones with MDE.
Great. Sorry for the technical difficulties. So this first slide is just showing what we're going to be presenting today. Basically an overview and discussion of the regulatory requirements and our rulemaking process, with some background that many of the council members have heard as we've gone through a number of these presentations before, but it doesn't hurt to cover this ground again. And with that being said, I'm going to turn this over to Mark Stewart, our program manager from the climate division or program.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Just a quick sound check. Can you hear me all right?
We can, thank you.
Okay, great. Mark Stewart, Climate Change Program Manager. Great being with you today. This is my first AQCAC meeting. I've been with MDE for about a year now. Dr. Salowich, great seeing you again. I was at the University of Maryland for the last 14 years and had the great chance to interact with a few of you, but especially Dr. Salowich. So great being reconnected. So the climate change program within MDE's air administration focuses, of course, primarily on reducing the state's greenhouse gas emissions. Methane emissions, as we're going to talk about in this presentation, is a significant source of GHG emissions in the state. And because of some new accounting methodology that came into play in 2022, it's actually an even more significant source of emissions in the state. So why don't you go ahead and advance to slide number 5. Just a little bit of background here, some of which you may well know, but Maryland, we've got a long history of climate action. We created an independent and bipartisan Maryland Commission on Climate Change back in 2007, which led to some of the state's earlier work on producing greenhouse gas emission reduction plans. That commission has existed for a long while now, continuously serving its core mission of producing recommendations to reduce GHG emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change. Reducing methane emissions has long been a major focus for that commission. Go ahead to the next slide, please. Excuse me. Across the board, Maryland is very focused on reducing GHG emissions. We continue to be at the cutting edge of incorporating the best science in our development of GHG reduction policy and measurements. The international research community is increasingly aware and concerned and pushing for policy action to reduce GHG emissions across the board, in part because of more and more evidence of the impacts of climate change on public health and loss of public property, unfortunately, some of which we're beginning to experience in Maryland as we see some of our communities impacted by once in a 1,000-year storms every few years, right? So in early 2021, MDE was proud to submit an aggressive GHG reduction plan for the state, which aimed to reduce statewide GHG emissions by 50% by 2030. We call that the 2030 GGRA plan. And then fast forward, why don't you go to the next slide, thanks. Fast forward to the General Assembly session in 2022, a few months after we submitted the plan, and the General Assembly raised the bar even higher. So we now have the most ambitious GHG reduction goal of any state in the nation. Our new target is not what's included in the GGRA plan of a 50% reduction by 2030, but rather a 60% reduction by 2031, and to achieve net zero statewide emissions by 2045. These are the most aggressive state GHG reduction goals in the nation. That law also very significantly, and especially for today's discussion, requires us to shift from using what's called the 100-year global warming potential of greenhouse gases to the 20-year global warming potential of greenhouse gases. And what that does is it kind of amplifies the global warming impact of your short-lived climate pollutants, including methane. So this landfill regulation is a critical measure for meeting the state's GHG reduction goals. That law, by the way, also included some other significant regulations that will come to AQCAC sometime in the next several months, including building energy performance standards, which require that large buildings in the state will achieve net zero direct emissions by 2040. Much more on that, of course, in future meetings. Next slide. So methane, when we look at methane using the 20-year global warming potential, the takeaway here is that global warming potential is the way of measuring the warming impact of a certain quantity of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So when we look at that using the standard 100-year global warming potential, we see that methane has about 28 times the effect of 1 ton of CO2 in the atmosphere at trapping heat in the atmosphere. When you shorten that time frame to examining the warming impact over a 20-year lifespan, as we're now required to do via the Climate Solutions Now Act of 2022, we see that methane is more than 80 times as potent as a greenhouse gas as CO2. So it's really, really amplifying the importance of methane in our inventory, which you'll see in our next slide here. So the 2020 GHG inventory, which we just released last month, actually earlier this month, we're still in October, is the first time that MDE shifted to using the 20-year global warming potential for all greenhouse gases. You see that methane emissions accounts for about 15% of the state's total GHG emissions, and of that, landfills account for about 40% of the total methane emissions statewide. So, very significant part of our GHG inventory, and landfills are a very significant source of methane in the state. And I think I'm handing this off to someone else at this point.
Yeah. Can everybody hear me?
We hear you now, Eddie.
Okay. I think we got it straight. Okay, Randy, you can go on to the next slide. Okay, as Tad mentioned a little bit earlier, the development of this regulation was a process that began a little bit over 3 years ago, and I know the council is always interested in our stakeholder outreach efforts. It's during this time, MDA, we held at least 2 stakeholder meetings, and as a result of those meetings, we got numerous comments as a result. And a lot of comments came from a diversity of stakeholders. These include landfill owners and operators, advocacy groups, and concerned citizens. And many of these comments range from the subject matter of climate change, which Mark talked about, waste diversion, to compliance issue, to some voluntary measures. You can go to the next slide, Randy. This is a map of all the municipal solid waste landfills in Maryland. The red dots denote the closed landfills. The green dot denote the active or open landfills. As you can see from this map, most of the landfills are located within the Central Maryland corridor, which is Baltimore, Washington. And if I were to look at this map and draw any conclusions, it would appear that there's some correlation between the population density, as I mentioned, Central Maryland's heavily populated, and the number of landfills. Okay, next slide, Randy. Okay, this is where I mentioned the factoid of the day. And this is according to EPA, municipal solid waste landfills are the 3rd largest source of methane emissions in the United States. And you can see the composition of landfill gas here. The majority of landfill gas is made up of methane, but it's also composed of other constituents as well. I want you to pay attention in particular to the trace gases. because part of trace gases are made of non-methane organic compounds. And the reason this is important is because these are the focus of the federal requirements for municipal solid waste landfills and the majority of the state regulations pertaining to municipal solid waste landfills as well. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Randy. And speaking of state regulations and landfills, these are just some of the existing regulations that are applicable to municipal solid waste landfills. You can see here that the majority of them are that apply fall under solid waste. There's also one that it is under the CO2 NOx budget trading program, and there's also one under our air program, but it's kind of outdated. This proposed regulation, that we're proposing today, will replace that regulation that you see right there. Okay, next slide, Randy. And these are the federal regulations here that are applicable to municipal solid waste landfills. You can see them that we have the emission guidelines. These are more towards older landfills, and these are more recent, I think 2016, and this subpart replaced subpart CC. We also have one that is new source performance standards. This is new subpart XXX. This previously replaced subpart WWW. And we also have the NESHAP, which is the National Emission Standards for Hazardous Air Pollutants. This has been in the book since the 90s. It was recently updated a couple years ago by EPA. And there also is federal plans for, which is subpart 000. This is for existing landfills that do not have a state plan. What this does is it covers them with a state plan. Okay, next slide, Randy. Now, during the stakeholder process, the previous two meetings, I mentioned that there were two basic drivers to our regulatory process. And one was the federal standards I kind of mentioned previously in the previous slide, which were the new source performance standards and emission guidelines for municipal solid waste landfills that were developed and came out in 2016. And there's also a little bit what Mark mentioned, which is the need to minimize methane emissions as part of Maryland's climate change efforts. And during this process, we also looked at what some other states were doing. We also looked at what some other states were doing, and also as far as municipal solid waste landfills. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Randy. Okay, this is the next couple of slides. I'm getting into the regulation itself, and the first couple of slides, I'm going to compare what I talked a little bit about the federal regulation compared to our proposed regulation itself as far as applicability and exemptions. This particular slide is the applicability. You can see both of them, both the federal requirements and the proposed regulation. They both apply to municipal solid waste landfills. Size-wise, the federal regulation, it has a design capacity, which is it applies to landfills that are greater than 2.5 million tons and 3.26 cubic meters of waste. Ours is, that's a mass and a volumetric basis. Ours is pretty much just strictly a mass basis, which applies to landfills that have more than 250,000 tons of waste in place. You can see the age here. You have the EG. It applies to existing landfills. After a certain date, they accept the waste. The NSPS applies to landfills constructed or modified after a certain time. Our regulation is based on a accepted waste date and is consistent with the date that you'll find in the emission guidelines. Okay, Randy, you can go to the next slide. Okay, these are the exemptions for the landfills. Again, you have it split up into the federal requirements and the proposed requirements. The federal requirements exempt landfills that mentioned the previous slide, that design capacity. It exempts landfills that are underneath of that size. There are also exemptions in the federal regulations for certain depending on the rate of non-methane organic compounds, certain landfills can be exempt. Active landfill, I believe, is 37 tons per year. Closed landfills, certain requirements do not apply if you're below 55 tons per year of non-methane organic compounds. Our regulations exempts closed and active landfills that fall below 450 tons of waste in place or design capacity below 2.75 tons of 2.75 tons and 3.26 tons of cubic yards of waste that were accepted before after December 31st, 1993. And you can see the types of landfills, they're pretty similar. Hazardous waste, landfills regulated under CERTA. The reason why these landfills wouldn't fall underneath of our regulations is because these types of landfills generally do not produce a lot of landfill gas. They don't accept a lot of organic compounds, unlike a municipal solid waste landfill. And there's also additional standards here we have for closed and inactive landfills. They have installed or operated solar panels or arrays on or before January 1st, 2024 that meet certain requirements. Now, I'll talk about this a little later and on the presentation. I'll get back to this. Okay, next slide, Randy. Okay, these are the proposed requirements for municipal solid waste landfills. We're kind of getting to the regulation itself, so I kind of split it into landfills I split it into different categories, which is landfills that fall below the 250,000 tons of waste in place, and landfills that are equal to or greater than 450 tons of waste in place. You can see here the active landfills. If you're below the 450 tons of waste in place, all you have to do is submit annual tonnage reports. My understanding is that these landfills are already required to do that as far as our solid waste program. So that's not something that we're asking out of the ordinary. And you keep submitting this until either you submit the landfill closes and they submit a closure notification to the department. Landfills that are above that, they would submit an initial waste in place report. Methane generation rate, it's not going to be applicable. Generally, smaller landfills, they don't generate a lot of methane, so this regulation will really apply to them. What we're asking for is landfills that are above this, you calculate the methane generation rate and submit this report to the department. The next one is liquid addition. This wouldn't apply to smaller landfills. These are specific requirements for bioreactive landfills. I know it interests the council. Currently, we don't have any of these in Maryland, but we did have a pilot program that started back in the early 2000s. I think it ran for 2 years until 2003, 2004, and that was that. But these standards that you see here, the equivalent of the standards that you find in these SHAP that I mentioned for landfills. We also have maintenance requirements, which is all landfills must maintain cover integrity and a program for repairs. And much of this that you see here, this is always specified underneath our solid waste regulations that you'll find in COMAR. And all we're doing is we're codifying it underneath our air quality regulations. And we feel this is good because this is sort of a preventative program, and you have preventative programs that addresses potential issues, before it becomes a much larger issue. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Randy. Okay, we had the proposed methane generation rate. I kind of mentioned it. This is pretty much how much methane a landfill is generating, and this is on an annual basis. Landfills I mentioned before, landfills under 450,000 tons of waste in place. This is pretty much not going to apply to those landfills. Those landfills are exempt underneath that. Landfills greater than this, though, you have certain requirements, and you can see here on the right-hand column. Active landfills, you have to, for, let's say, if you have roughly less than 332 tons per year of methane generation that you calculated, what you would do if you're an active landfill, you would calculate annually until either that rate is above that or you have a closure notification to MDE. Now, closed landfills, all you have to do is submit a final methane generation report and closure notification to the department. Now, you have a middle category, which is landfills that fall, you have a methane generation rate is which is greater than 332 tons per year, but it's kind of less than the 548 tons per year. With those landfills, they have a choice. They would either have to install or operate a gas collection control system, or they could demonstrate via quarterly surface monitoring the methane concentration levels are below 200 parts per million by volume. Now, just to give it a quick note here, some landfills, they may decide, hey, it may be our benefit. We'll go ahead and we'll install the gas collection control system. Now, the next one is for landfills that are greater than 8,548 tons per year. And I was asked about this date. This is comparable to, and you look at the federal requirements, to the 37 tons per year of non-methane organic compounds. If you remember the previous slide, I mentioned that the non-methane organic compounds were very trace and very small, and methane was very, very was the biggest category within landfill gas. Well, if you calculate and you find the equivalent, it would be of that non-methane organic compounds emitted, it would be that amount and as far as methane. And what we would say is you install and operate a gas control system and comply with the requirements of the regulation itself. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Randy. Next slide. Okay, this is the basic flow chart of what I just discussed here, and it's a better illustration of what I discussed. And you can see here there are specific requirements for landfill based on landfill characteristics and landfill status. So it's pretty explanatory. Okay, Randy, next slide.
Oh, hey, Eddie, I'm sorry. This is Carolyn Jones, and I don't mean to interrupt,
Sure.
but I think because we've been talking these technical details for several years now, right? We're into the nitty gritty and things that the landfills and operators definitely understand. But just for the council's sake, you know, when you break this all down and you see this flow chart, there's about 32 landfills that we feel that are going to be affected. And it gets categorized. There's probably about 5 that will just have to submit a report, which follows the top flow chart. And then there's a group of medium-sized landfills that Eddie was explaining that have that greater than 450, but have a smaller methane generation rate. And they will probably have to do some testing that Eddie's going to get into. And may or may not have to have a gas collection system. And then there's about 16 very large landfills that have to follow the federal NRs. So I just wanted to add that clarifying point because Eddie's going to get into some more details on the techniques of testing and looking for methane. So
Okay.
thank you.
Thank you, Carolyn. All right, Randy, you can go to the next slide. Now, this slide lists the requirements depending on the surface monitoring that I mentioned, and Carolyn kind of touched on a little bit. And basically, if you're below 200 parts per million, it's just the quarterly monitoring. You do that on an annual basis, and you do that on a quarterly basis. And the other one is if you're above 200 ppmv, if you happen to, let's say, do the monitoring and you do test above that, you will have to install and operate a gas control system. Now, next slide. Now, let's say if I mentioned that you test and it's above the 200 ppm V, you would have to install an operating gas collection control system. These next couple of slides would probably apply. You can see the design plan is design plan installation is pretty straightforward and is pretty equivalent to what you will find in the federal regulations, the NSPS and EG. The proposed regulation details requirements and standards when operating a gas collection control system, which include routing or drawing landfill gas to the device itself. Next slide, Randy. Now, this slide describes the requirements for various gas control systems. And I mentioned, oh, this is the right one? Okay, never mind. These are just basic, that's right.
Eddie,
Okay, you
maybe
got
I
it.
didn't the slide. Is this the one you?
Yeah, yeah, okay, you flipped ahead, okay. Uh, this basically describes the requirements for various gas collection control systems. And you have it broken down. You have enclosed flares. They must meet a destruction efficiency of at least 99% and meet other requirements in the regulation. There is open flares. We do allow the use of these until January 1st, 2025. And after this date, it requires approval by the department. And we do say that if you operate one of these, it must be in accordance with 40 CFR 60.18. Just a couple of notes on the open flares. The reason why we're phasing them out is that they're not easily sampled for compliance testing and may not be feasible for source or efficiency testing. But on the other hand, we do say that there may be legitimate reasons for their continual use. One is you may have a landfill which may not produce enough gas to operate other control devices. So in that case, an enclosed flare probably wouldn't be feasible, but the use of an open flare would. And we do have a provision which allows for the use of control devices other than flares, and there are landfills that actually use this for use landfill gas for secondary purposes. Sometimes they use it for heating, and also they use the gas methane for other purposes. So, you flip to the next slide. Now, this is a description of the performance testing for gas collection control systems. What we basically say for timetable is 80 days of startup for new devices and 80 days 80 days after the effective date of regulation for existing units. We also want new devices to conduct a subsequent annual test within 45 days of the 1-year anniversary of the initial test. Now, the conditions are explanatory. Obviously, you can't test for something that's not working or, in this case, malfunctioning. The schedule is annual, but just a note here, it can be conducted every 3 years if it's in compliance after 3 consecutive tests. But if it's out of compliance during those 3 years, it reverts back to annual. And there are also exemptions, which is it's not required of boilers and process heaters with a design capacity less than 44 megawatts that burn landfill gas. Okay, next slide.
I'd just like to ask if there's a caller on the line that if you please mute, we're getting a little feedback.
Okay, I talked a little bit about the surface emissions monitoring, and Carolyn kind of mentioned a little bit as well in the previous slides. And the proposal contains 2 standards. The first one we're going to talk about is the instantaneous emission standards. And this involves a surface reading using a hydrocarbon detector at intervals along a walking pattern. And and a monitoring grid. And the emissions limit, it cannot exceed 500 ppmv. You do see one there. I did mention earlier the 200 ppmv earlier. This is where landfills without the gas collection control system have to do the monitoring, depending on waste in place and methane generation rate. And they have a choice between conducting the surface emission monitoring or installing the gas collection control system. And the frequency for these is quarterly, but under certain conditions, it can shift to annual. And let's say you have a seasons over 500 ppmv emission limit, then you will be required to take corrective actions. And some of these could be cover maintenance or repair, or just adjustments to the gas control system. Next slide, Randy. Okay, the next one is integrated, and this is the second standard, and this is sort of different. Whereas I talked about the instantaneous, where you're walking along a pathway and you're taking readings, or you're taking readings at intervals. What you're doing is this involves taking an average of all the surface readings within a monitoring grid, and the emissions limit for this is 25 ppmv, and this is slightly lower than instantaneous. Let's say I get this question, why is it so low than 25 than the 500? What you're doing is let's say you have a room and you have one of those digital thermometers, and you're required to take temperature readings within that room. Well, if you're doing it in intervals, you're just looking for, okay, where is it above, let's say our category is 100 Fahrenheit. You're just looking at for anything that exceeds the 100. With the integrated, you're just taking points within that room. You may have some that are very high temperatures. You may have some that they have no readings. And what you're doing is you're taking an average of all those readings. It could be hundreds of readings. It could be thousands of readings. And you're taking the average of that. And that's the number you get. And that's the average. Now, one note with that is the reason you do this is because it helps, it gives you a snapshot of potential areas of concern before they get larger. And what we say is if there's a grid and it sees a concentration limit of 25 ppmv, you must identify these areas and you remediate it. And one note I'll leave before I leave this slide, both instantaneous and integrated monitoring can be performed at the same time. Next slide, Randy. Okay, I did mention the testing frequency in the previous slide, which is quarterly, but under certain conditions, it can be shifted to annual. And exceedance for both monitoring standards can be identified and remediated. In addition to the monitoring parameters, surface areas of landfills with cover penetrations, cracked seeps must be inspected visually and with a hydrocarbon detected. So, next slide. The next one is, it deals with, I think you skipped ahead a little bit. There we go. Again, instrumentation, I mentioned, is a hydrocarbon detector, and we specify in the regulation it has to meet EPA method 21. The only caveat to this is that whereas EPA, they're geared more towards non-methane organic compounds, we're towards methane, so methane replaces the references to VOC. Landfill area is 50,000 square foot grids, and the walking pattern is 25. Next slide. Now, there are certain conditions where these tests can be performed. Testing cannot be performed when wind speeds exceed 25 miles per hour, and we do understand that this may be, as far as wind speed, an issue with certain landfills. That's why we do say the wind barrier, which is sort of like a funnel, uh, maybe it has to be used when wind speed exceeds 4 miles per hour, or you have gusts more than 10 miles per hour. One other requirement is that you have to use an on-site anemometer, and testing can be conducted when there's no precipitation for 72 hours, which is roughly 3 days. Next slide, Randy. Okay, the next two slides is simply go over the procedures for landfills, what they should use for monitoring gas control system. Now, this slide itself, it specifies that landfills with gas collection control systems installed, operated, and maintain specific requirement according to manufacturer specifications and instructions. And the requirements are listed based on equipment types such as enclosed flares, boilers, process heaters, and devices other than enclosed flares. And I wanted to add that these requirements here are the equivalent to the requirements found in the NESHAP for municipal solid waste landfill. So they're the same as the federal requirements itself. Okay, next slide. This slide just basically lists the requirements for monitoring leaks and components containing landfill gas and positive pressure on a quarterly basis. And what we require, you see, component leaks that are equal to or greater than 500 parts per million by volume. These are to be tagged and remediated within 10 days, while leaks that are equal to or greater than 200 ppmv ought to be recorded. And we just want to record it just to see, okay, you note these is a problem and you note this is there. So that's basically what that is. Other requirements are for landfills with gas to energy facilities to conduct quarterly component leak testing prior to any scheduled maintenance or outages. And the gas pressure and the gas collection header applies to each individual well must be measured on a monthly basis. And if any positive pressure exists, corrective action must be taken within 5 days. Okay, next slide, Randy. Okay, this slide deals with wellhead monitoring. This is straightforward. All this is the proposed regulation contains monitoring provisions for wellheads. And only thing I would add is these equivalent to the wellhead monitoring provisions found in the NSPS for municipal solid waste landfills. So what you see here is the equivalent of federal requirements for municipal solid waste landfills as it pertains to wellhead monitoring. Next slide. This slide notes the monitoring provisions in case of malfunction, repair, and other activities in the proposed regulation. And again, the only thing I will add is these are consistent with the federal requirements for monitoring systems as far as compliance. So what you see here is equivalent to what you will find in the federal standards. Next slide. Now, for sake of time, I didn't go into a whole bunch of things because, as you can see, I'm pretty sure the regulation was pretty long. So I tried to give out most of the important parts of the regulation, but there are other parts. There's alternate compliance portion of the regulation. What this basically says is that, let's say if you're a landfill, you may request alternate to requirements for there were certain sections, and these sections are pertaining to gas collection and control systems, monitoring requirements, and test methods and procedures. The only caveat is that landfills have to demonstrate the alternative is equivalent to the requirement you wish to substitute for, and that's fair. You have to do this in writing. We also have record keeping and reporting requirements. Most of these are the equivalent which you will find in the federal regulation. Only thing I would add is that we do comply with the electronic reporting requirements that you will find in the federal regulations. So we're the equivalent on that. test methods and procedures. Many of those that you see in our regulation, they're referenced, they're EPA methods. So they're the same. The last one is permanent shutdown of a gas collection control system. And these are pretty similar to the federal requirements. And what it basically says, if it's a closed landfill and it's been operating a gas collection system, they may remove and cap it if it's been in operation for at least 15 years and demonstrate the emissions level of a certain threshold. Only difference is with EPA's regulation, the threshold is 37 tons per year. Our regulation, you have to demonstrate that it's below the 732 tons per year, and you have to demonstrate this on 3 consecutive tests. They do have a size difference as well. Ours is for landfills that are above the 450,000 tons of waste in place. EPA is design capacity I mentioned, where you have the mass and you have the volumetric basis. Next slide, Randy. Now, I brought this up a little earlier where I talked about the solar panels and arrays. This whole issue, there were a number of sources that had solar panels installed, who were considering solar panels, that expressed concerns about the proposed regulation. And part of this is our brainstorming. We set up a process that would address some of these concerns. First thing I want to mention is that Land Management Administration approves the solar panel requests. Yeah. We also want to add a couple of mention that we wanted to address the concerns. Part of it was we want to add a couple of requirements to this process, and it's starting with exempting landfills that meet certain requirements in the regulation. You can see here, closed missile solid waste landfills are in active areas of active missile solid waste landfills that closed or last accepted waste prior to July 17, 2014. Landfills that have less than 250 million tons or 3.27 cubic yards of municipal solid waste, or landfills that have solar panels and arrays that were installed prior to January 1st, 2024. You can go to the next slide. The next thing we want to do is we want to encourage and support the development of solar panels and arrays at landfills. I think the council will agree that this is beneficial because it encourages the use of clean, renewable energy sources such as solar power, and it's also a strategy that repurposes a lot of closed and capped landfills. And just to mention briefly, there are several states that allow the building of solar panels on landfills. Maryland's one of them, but particularly in the Northeast, two stand out in particular, that's New York and Massachusetts. Lastly, we kind of wanted to put several requirements in place for solar development at landfills going forward. And what we said is if you're after January 1st, 2014, if you're a closed landfill or you're a closed area of an active landfill with less than 2.5 million tons or 3.26 cubic yards of waste, you must meet certain requirements. Also, landfills with a design capacity over 2.75 million tons of waste, they must meet certain requirements. And one of those is a approved plan by Land Management Administration. Real quick, I want to thank them. They've been very helpful as far as this regulation, helping us with other parts of this regulation, including the solar panel portion of this. Just wanted to do that. Other one is complying with certain maintenance requirements. We kind of mentioned this. We wanted to put a program in place that's sort of a maintenance program and addresses any potential issues that may arise before it gets problemsome. Also, some landfills may be required to submit an alternate compliance plan. I kind of mentioned that in the previous regulation, in the previous slide, for surface emission monitoring. Okay, you can go to the next slide, Randy. Emissions reduction, estimated emissions reduction. I would say there are a couple things you have to consider when estimating methane emissions from landfills. And one of them is that landfills are a function of different variables such as temperature, composition, etc. Just basically, if I were to take a landfill and it's a particular size, it's the same in particular size, and it gets a certain amount of waste and move it to a different state or even next door, it can produce landfill gas at a different rate than that particular landfill. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The other one is that landfill gas kind of it's in four phrases, or it's in four different uh, uh, various states of generation, which you have an earlier state, which is the first 5 or 6 years when waste is placed. Uh, you have gas that's produced after several decades, and then you have after the waste is placed, the landfill is closed. That latter portion generally does not produce a lot of landfill gas. With that said, we estimate from the regulation reduction in landfill gas as a result of increased monitoring, minimizing and fixing leaks, and increased methane capture. And we estimate that maybe 25 to 40% reduction in landfill gas emissions from landfills that are subject to this proposed regulation when the regulation is fully implemented. Next slide. Okay, this is some of the estimated cost. This is the cost of compliance, and it's based on applicability status, reporting requirements, and control costs. You can see here we split it into two categories. One is landfill subject to the reporting requirements only. These are primarily going to be the landfills that I mentioned that fall underneath below the 450,000 tons of waste in place category. They may have to submit reports. So the average cost is going to be roughly $4,000. You're going to have landfills that are subject to reporting, monitoring, and control requirements. Those are primarily going to be your larger, medium to larger landfills. We estimate the reporting costs are probably going to stay the same. You're probably going to have monitoring costs. I mentioned the surface emission monitoring for some landfills. Capital costs, that's pretty what that entails is pretty much either installing and operating a gas control and collection system. In some cases, landfill may already have a gas collection control system, and what they may have to do is do some modifications to that. So there may be some additional cost to that. And you're going to have operation and maintenance costs. We talked about some of the programs as far as maintenance, as far as the landfills, upkeep, so forth. Those can range anywhere from $150,000 to $400,000 of cost. Okay, next slide. This is the last slide. Thankfully, this is just a regulatory schedule and key dates. Today was the AQCAC meeting that you're presently before us. There are other dates such as November, which is the signatures for the adoption process, the proposed regulation in December, and potential public hearing and final adoption sometime at least 5 months down the road. I don't know if Randy or Carolyn, you want to add anything to this slide? You're free to add anything you want to the slide.
Thank you, Eddie. We greatly appreciate it. And this is just a standard process that the department goes through for the adoption of regulations and the time frame that's associated with that. I see Mr. Quinn has his hand up.
Yeah, so I think this would be a great first slide to this deck. So I just, a lot of comprehensive, it's deep. I understand it's a lot of work and a lot of deep digging into the landfill thing. But to me, for this council, if we think about how we can touch this in a fast way and give you good advice, maybe this, and as part of your presentation at the beginning, talk about the landfills you've talked to and what their concerns were and how you've addressed them and what you couldn't address and what you did address would be a good way to get us to the point where it's hard. Right now, I feel like I have a lot of information in my hand and I'm going to defer to you generally after a discussion, but I just feel like up front what our goal was and how we got there would be been useful addition to the presentation.
Thank you, John. I appreciate the comment. And in terms of the comments we did receive, Carolyn, did you want to touch upon that broadly? That, you know, that it was a broad set of comments that we did receive. There were some suggestions that even came in from council members and some clarifications that we did make to the regulation that was sent out in the packet. But Carolyn, did you want to just maybe touch upon?
If I might add one thing to that, lots of times you come in and say, we've talked to everyone and there was consensus on this and this is really good. Or a couple of times you came to us and said, they hate this, but we really have to go through it because of law. So that concept at the beginning would be good. And Carolyn, I'm sure, has all that in her head.
Okay, yes, thank you. And I apologize. The details that we got into were more of the focus, obviously, well, of the landfill owners, right? Getting into the technical details of what piece that they're going to have expenditures on was important. So we have heard, you know, over the past several years from both sides where people are very concerned that we should be having the most stringent methane control methods possible. And then on the other side, that the economics of that sometimes can not fit into that agenda. So this regulation tried to have a middle point where we are more stringent than the federal that we had to meet, but also had some exceptions in there that allowed for less hardships on the costs. But the surface emission monitoring and the testing that follows the EPA procedures right now is the only regulated method that's out there. We do have in our regulation that emerging technologies are available so that if something comes along that is less expensive or easier to use, then our regulation can capture that. But so I feel like, you know, the pieces that we have in there of the details of the design system and how do you detect methane are following the standards that a few other states have and that the federal government has. So, right, I think I answered that. Right, there was concerns that we weren't doing enough, and then there was concerns that it was too stringent. So we're hoping that we land somewhere in between.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. And any members of the council want to ask a question?
I want to ask, I don't see where the raise the hand icon is. So I have two questions. I'm Bob Wright. Did you calculate a cost per ton of removal? You have a lot of data there, but it might also be interesting to know the cost per ton. And the other is, I didn't see any mention of buying offsets. So I assume that no one anticipates that they could buy offsets to meet the regulation.
For the first part, the cost per ton, no, the figures weren't set up that way. We do have a more detailed spreadsheet that matches our greenhouse gas inventory that gets in line item by the particular facilities and does that cost range. So we didn't do it by ton, but that probably could be produced. And then, as you were saying, to buy credits, I'm I'm not sure. Are we talking in the GGRA? I don't think that it's something that.
Yeah, there are no offset provisions in this regulation.
There were some questions about other incentive programs. So there is one MEA program that had recently given a grant to Midshore Landfill in Easton, and it was under the Open Energy Grant Program. And then there's also, and that was to put in a landfill gas to energy engine to produce electricity. And then there's also another Maryland Smart Energy Communities program that's specific to local governments that many of these landfills could take advantage of. Plus, then there's numerous solar programs that are available as well.
I see Mr. Schoen's hand up.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. So in 01 applicability, the installation of solar panels. So the way I read this, it's 01 B4. That applies only to closed or inactive from the way I read it, but it doesn't seem to have any criteria for minimum generation. So it seems like a pretty broad exemption, and I wanted some clarification on that.
Oh, yeah, I can answer. I don't have the reg, or I could pull it up but there is the large landfills that are 2.5 million tons of waste in place meet the federal criteria. So those don't fall into this exemption because they have to follow the NSPS.
I'm talking about B4 solar panels.
Right. So then that exemption is tailored and should be set up to be allowed for just the medium size landfills that have the panels installed. So only closed, and that a size between 450,000 tons and 2.5 million. So that's where the
But my question is, you put up one solar panel and you're exempt. There doesn't seem to be any generation criterion.
That I would agree that is not written into the regulation at this time. Yes.
This is Carolyn, this is the provision for arrays that are put up in the next 14 months, right? January 1st, 2024.
Yes, or whatever is installed now.
Yeah. So the thought here was to, this was one of the comments we received, is that there are lots of landfills that already have panels up or that are already pretty far along in the process of putting panels up, in which case they do have to follow a pretty comprehensive process by the land administration downstairs. And so, once the panels are up, it's challenging, right? There are some operational constraints for emissions monitoring for the collection system. And so the thought here is that for ones that already have a solar array up or are really far along in the process, that there would be some exemptions.
I get all that, but I'm going to move on to my next question, but I still have concerns that there's no size of system or generation criterion. It seems to be a very broad exemption. So my next question, I'll let you think about it and see if you can come up with something that answers that size criterion or generation rate question. But let me go on to 4043. I guess it's B. So and this relates, I'm trying to wrap my mind around the whole concentration, parts per million process. I don't know what else to call it. So I'm trying to understand. So you've got a medium size here, and you have to demonstrate that emission is less than a certain concentration. I'm not sure. and maybe I don't understand, I understand very little, I will say, about how a landfill actually looks or operates. I assume it's got some kind of cover and wellheads, but maybe you can describe that a little bit, and maybe that background will help understand it. But to go from concentration to actual emissions, you have to multiply, it seems to me, by a flow rate, and I don't see that in here. So I guess I'm trying to understand the reason for this middle group where you either do a GCCS, a collection and control system, or you show that your concentration is low. I'm trying to understand the reason for that alternate compliance path for the medium-sized ones.
So this is the category, the group of landfills that are most affected by our reg. The very large ones are NSPS already, or required under federal. So this medium-sized landfill is the more general impact of our reg. And what we're trying to do is say you don't have to install a gas collection system right away, or if by just a generic modeled calculation equation, you show that your generation rate would be under that 732. And there's a lot of conditions, just like you were saying, based on the size, based on what waste is there, how long that it's been covered, how deep, what the rain conditions are.
I'm confused already, because you just said less than 732, and I'm talking about 3, which is between 732 and 8548.
Okay, so if you do this calculation and you're below it, you're right, you fall under the B1.
But
If
3
you're
is not
between the
about
732 and the larger number, to get to the larger size, that group, instead of putting a gas collection system in right away, because that's quite expensive, and perhaps there really isn't enough gas, even though you have a modeled number, you still need a full gas design. So what we're allowing instead is a surface emission monitoring test for a year. You have to go out 4 times in the year to see if gas is seeping up through the surface. So that's that middle ground. If you have, and then that detection number is slightly lower than the systems or the landfills that have a gas collection system already installed. So we've lowered that number. You have to go out and you do this surface testing. You check all around the perimeter. If they maintain below that for a year, then you don't have to install the gas collection system.
And what's the meaning of it? What's the, I mean, if you have a concentration but a high flow rate, you could have significant emissions. So
this is the case when there isn't a gas collection system there. So the flow rate isn't designed. It's just the equations of using how methane degrades, and the other conditions that are at the site to give you a possible modeled methane generation rate. They haven't actually done a well or a probe into the landfill to determine that.
This is using surface emission monitoring, walking the grid of the landfill, not from a point.
right, and I noticed you don't allow integrated in this item B.
No, this is all, you're right. This is it's a modeled calculation.
But it's not modeled, it's measured, it's measured concentration. Item B says.
So that's right. So this is the 200 ppm threshold that is measured at a specific place during the grid measurement. That's not the integrated where it's averaged across the area. So that's when if that detector pops above 200, that means there's a lot of methane coming out, and that's the threshold where if you can show for a year over 4 consecutive quarters there is no measurement showing that. That's when you can continue to monitor in lieu of putting in collection system.
So if this is Ross, if I can just weigh in here, I think Larry's confused, and I share his point. If everywhere you walked, the concentration of methane were 180, you'd be below 200. If in another landfill, if everywhere you walked, it was close to 0, but in one spot it was 220, they would be in violation. And most atmospheric scientists would say that the place where it's 180 walking all the way around is emitting more methane than the second case where it's near 0 and there's one 220 hotspot. So, you know, it's a very loose way to try to truly ascertain what the methane flux is. And I've done my own research over the weekend, and I realized what you have is based on what other states have done and their connections to EPA. But this is very old-fashioned way of doing it, and it's very loosey-goosey, because what really does matter is, you know, it's the methane flux, it's atmospheric flow rate, you know, and the concentration, and just going to the maximum. Of course, we all have history with that, with air quality exceedances. So now it's like a methane exceedance. So Larry, I share your concern, and I hope my illustration of 180 versus near 0 and 220 helps solidify why.
And that
Thank
makes
you
sense. In this case, that's when there's no cover, right? This is for a methane that doesn't have a cover in place. So you would expect the measurements to be relatively uniform as compared to a cover where there's a leak, right? If there's a cover, then the measurements should be very low, except if you find a leak, then it gets really high. But if there's no cover, you know, there would be variation, but maybe it would be lower. But Carolyn, in a case where it really is measuring 180 all the way across, and this is a landfill that's large enough to fall in this medium category, would we expect the total generation rate to be greater than 732?
No, that's why, you know, if it's consistent and under the 180, right, the generation capability is expected to be lower. And by the time you would put in a whole gas collection system, it would be intermittent and not be able to produce the gas that you need to suck out of it.
Just
So
not to
that's where the numbers are.
Conversation. Larry, are you, just to go, because Larry started this line of questioning, you finished, Larry?
Well, I appreciate Ross's illustrating it, helping me think it through. I think I'm done asking my question, but I don't really understand the result. It still depends. I mean, you get a concentration, as Ross said, it depends on the flow rate, which is a function of how quickly the gas is coming up through each area of surface and the size of the surface area. So I don't know where to go with this.
But we don't have a suggestion at this point. We're just still inquiring, correct?
I mean, I guess a suggestion would be, why have this exemption at all? We've got a middle category that we've determined it emits a significant amount to make a difference. Why even have exemption B? I guess that would be the easiest solution. And I haven't heard a convincing argument yet. Is it impractical? Is it, you know, what's the problem with requiring it?
Anyone?
Carolyn sort of touched upon that some of these landfills are nearing their life expectancy of their methane production. And as it's getting lower and lower at that point, you're finding the ability of the gas collection systems to be less efficient. So when you're nearing the end stage, it may be 2 years, maybe just a year, that installing a gas collection will actually generate enough methane to safely operate that device. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense that this is a one, not quite exemption, but just a method to go around and determine that there are not high surface emission monitoring coming off of the site. So
Oh, okay, but are you saying that the gas collection systems require a certain concentration in order to function properly?
yes, and sometimes a facility may have to actually pump in additional gas into the system to burn the flare properly.
Sounds
So
like a
then
cost effectiveness issue.
right. And in response, like thinking through Ross's example, I mean, is it expected that you get a more uniform rate across the entire landfill, or is it common that you get that situation where you have hot spots and low spots, or is it more uniform?
I think it varies throughout the landfill, just based on the density and the compaction and how, yeah, so it varies.
But does it vary as much as Ross's example, or is it expected to be more uniform?
I guess I can't say. I have not been out in the field, and maybe one of our compliance inspectors could say, but I can say that, for the larger landfills that already have this surface emission requirement, they will come in and have perhaps 10 locations throughout the large acres of landfill that had an exceedance, where they have to go back and do some retrofits with the surface cover. So that, I think, would be a typical example. So 10 spots throughout is not uniform. So, and we are really just looking for the exceedances. So those are the reports that I've seen, not, I'm going to assume the rest.
And in the details, which I'm not sure I've covered, I'm not sure I've read completely the details. Does it tell you how thorough that walk around has to be?
Very specific, and it's every 25 feet, and it has to be a specific cross section. It's all mapped out. It does use modern technology, and yeah. So, and what we haven't heard for as well is that the landfill facilities have not come back with a separate request or suggestion on what might be a better technology to use here. So emerging technologies are allowed, and something like a drone, and I think facilities are using that. But as far as measurements in this regulatory format, this is what's available, is what we're hearing. But the discussion of expanding those technologies has been going on for several years, and EPA had 2 full-day seminars on this last January. So those discussions are coming, but this is the regulatory format.
If I might, just to focus us, Larry, so we're advising the department on whether to promulgate this. Would this exemption move you away from approving it, or is there room just to think out loud that we could move it forward? We could say yes to this in your mind, and then tell them they should really focus on this and make sure there's a tight protocol in place and look at better ways to achieve this goal.
I have to think it through. I mean, I think overall, I obviously support the thrust of the regulation. I need to think this part through. So move on.
I just put it, and Mr. Young put his hand up right at the beginning, and I just want to make sure I get to him pretty quickly.
Yep. Move on. Yep.
Mr. Young, you might be on mute. And I see you, Dr. Salowitz. I'll call you next. Or sooner if Mr. Young's mic can't get working. Just for people to know, when that happens, it happens to me all the time. There's always an option to sign in by phone too, and he's going to call in, and then we'll go to Dr. Salowitz now. It happens to me about a third of these meetings. So thanks for working with us, Mr. Young. And then Dr. Salowitz.
Okay, thanks. I'll try to be quick. I want to just channel into the official records some comments that Russ Dickerson, my colleague at University of Maryland, put in the chat. And that is that Russ and I advise MDE to just do some oversight of the calibration of the methane measurements. They walk around with a device that looks like this. I have one. It's a handheld device. It uses kind of low-tech technology to measure the methane compared to state-of-the-art scientific instruments. And we do have numerous groups in Maryland with the state-of-the-art scientific instruments. So your compliance officers might want to hook up with those folks who do that and occasionally spot check, because it's all the EPA stuff, and those of us who do this for a living question kind of the veracity, the truth of the EPA procedures. Just question it. Okay, my second point is that this is very old-fashioned, but I don't think we can possibly change it. That is the walking around and measuring the hotspots. But what we can do also from the compliance office is get infrared devices. So infrared devices, if you're close to the leak, provide really great ancillary information to what the leak looks like. And for, my example was extreme in both ways, but I don't, and I heard you say the drones. So use of the infrared through the compliance officers to help the landfill operators. What I'm really struck by reading this document, which is on my big screen over here, is how much is left up to the landfill operators. And so I don't really quite know how much partnership there is with MDE compliance officers, but I hope MDE has some of these infrared detectors. We had talked about that years ago, and we'll use them to help cap the leaks. Thank you all so much for use of the 20-year global warming potential for methane in your procedures, and this is a great step forward. That's all I got. Thank you.
Good, thank you. Mr. Young, are you on yet?
Yes, can you all hear me now?
We hear you great. Thanks for calling in.
Okay, no, thank you. Sorry for the issues. So yeah, good morning, everyone. I'd like to just start by saying that nothing I say is meant to downplay or ignore the impact of methane. It is a potent greenhouse gas, or question the significant methane generation at the municipal landfills. I want to thank staff. They put a lot of time and effort into this. It is clear, drafting these regulations, and I especially want to thank Tad, the best, wish him the best on his retirement. Upon receipt of these draft regulations, we reached out to all the counties for input. We were not able to pull much information in the short turnaround time. We've heard from 4 counties thus far, with only 3 able to come up with some sort of cost estimate. On the high end, Prince George's County currently estimates $300 million to comply. That may be high, it may be low. There's not enough time to do a deep dive into the actual impacts of what's being changed. I'm with Worcester County. We rely on consultants to do a lot of the regulatory work, including the air quality testing. Other than telling me new equipment is required to do these tests, I've yet to be given any sort of cost estimates to see if it compares to the economic impacts listed and given in the presentation. I will say, with a 25-foot by 25-foot grid on one landfill cell alone, that's 1,200 tests. So one of my first questions is this equipment that gives you a direct reading, or like other air quality tests, do we need to bottle it and send it for testing elsewhere? If anybody can answer that for me.
I think Dr. Salward showed you the instrument.
Yeah, so I'm just curious, like, if it gives a direct reading, then that may be easy to do 1,200 tests on that one cell. Even determining the waste in place for some of our older landfills, like that takes time to, to confirm with what MDE has on file. On the economic impact, you need to know that tipping fee costs at landfills impact everyone. Downstream impacts hit every household and business alike. There's a definite, not potential, impact to local governments with this. And I do feel this section could have gone into it a bit deeper. Large capital improvements like the installation of a gas collection and control system often requires bonding to fund. You know, that takes time because you have to get credit ratings, you have to go to Wall Street to get those. You got to go to the bond market. It's not a quick turnaround. And in the economic impact section, there's a whole paragraph that I think falls more into the background section. You know, it's not actually explaining the fiscal impact. On the solar panel regulations, can someone explain the 2024, the January 2024 cutoff date?
It was more linked to when we felt that the reg would be in effect, and anybody who has a solar panel installed after that is also able to do so. It's just that the medium-sized landfills may have to do some surface emission monitoring, whereas the exemption is for those that have already had that in place. But there is an alternate compliance option to use to also help or assist those landfills that do put in the solar panels to make sure that there is some surface emission monitoring, but that we understand that the detection method will have to be revised.
Okay, thank you for that. I just want to say supply chain issues alone is a reason to push this back, especially if you want to get more folks taking advantage of it or participating. You know, the design process, it's not just, I mean, you need to, you know, I toured Frederick County's landfill, one of their landfills recently, and it has a lot of potential, but the layout needs to take into consideration maintenance of the existing wells. You need to be able to adequately cut grass, wind load considerations, especially for the landfills that are above the tree line. You know, and then, you know, some landfills out there use the methane to generate electricity, and adding a solar electric load could require upgrades to the electric infrastructure, which then gets completely out of the control of any of the counties. You know, I would encourage the state push back, if anything, you know, given we're encouraging this. I realize, you know, you got to make a cutoff somewhere, but this does help on a variety of other fronts having this. In general, with the regulations, it would be helpful to have a comparison of the requirements being replaced to what the current regulations are, because that would shorten the time frame for counties to review the differences. It's nearly impossible for the counties to analyze the impact in the time that's been presented. You've mentioned some stakeholder meetings over the last 3 years. I've had 2 county landfills, separate counties under me, and I don't recall, was this part of a broader greenhouse gas discussion, or were these specific landfill methane stakeholder meetings?
These meetings were specific to the landfill methane work group that we established and reached out to all the counties starting in 2017, actually.
Okay. Yeah, I don't recall those. But again, I don't want to downplay the impact that landfills have on air quality, especially methane generation. I'm just saying time is needed to really review these regulations. And again, then time is needed to budget for, design, construct the necessary improvements. And I think, you know, just 5 months, it is an extremely tight turnaround time for counties to even remotely prepare or, you know, get ready for this. And I'm not saying it's not needed. I'm just saying we need more time to dig in. So my main thing is I would ask more time for an adequate analysis of these impacts, and just realize that from concept to going in ground, it's not a overnight process. It takes time to get in compliance with any new proposed regulation. So again, thank you all for the time, and staff for putting this together.
Thank you, Mr. Young. Real quickly, just like I tried to push, I'm not asking for your vote, but it's our job to be advisors to the department. Are you saying hold this all back, or you want to make recommendations to amend? Just give us a sense of what your overall message is.
I realize there's federal regulations we're in compliance with, so I do not want to put the state non-compliance with the federal government. But if there's an opportunity to push this back the entire process several months, that would be helpful to the counties to better analyze what's going on.
Thank you. That's very useful. Mr. Shelton, I see your hand up.
Yeah, so I have a few. So have any counties started to do this voluntarily?
I'll let MDE chime in because they're regulating. I mean, it's going to vary county to county. Again, Frederick County has a solar installation on a capped landfill. It's going to vary because some landfills are closed, some are about to be closed, some are still accepting waste. On the middle of the Eastern Shore, there are a conglomeration of counties that alternate what landfills get used. So there's landfills that are just sitting there open, not accepting waste because it's going to another county's landfill. But I think it would be easier for MDE to answer that question.
Yeah, and I go to be more specific, any counties that have started to install the gas collection systems?
Yeah, yes, there have been a number of landfills that have voluntarily installed a gas collection system.
And do we have any cost data on those? And can that somehow be translated into a cost per household?
Carolyn, do you have the numbers on that?
Cost per household, we have not looked at, but we have the data in the fact sheet. We have a brief paragraph on the cost impacts, but we have a little bit deeper breakdown into the sizes. I was saying before that there's 5 smaller to medium landfills that we think will just do the generation calculation rate and do an estimate for WIP, and that would be their only requirement, and we're estimating that as a $4,000 to $8,000 requirement. The other things like the SEMS testing, right, we have some research reports that are out on the internet, and we utilize EPA's data and a lot of Oregon and California who've done this regulation ahead of us. So that's where we're getting the figures. So we say a SEMS test cost $60,000 to perform. So it was the $240,000 a year. So that's how we've done the analysis.
But installing the systems, do we have any cost data on that too?
1 to 3 million is right, a range. There is I do have a dollar per acre figure. I don't have it in front of me. It came from a technical.
I guess I would ask maybe after the meeting if you can give us some maybe give us some feedback on cost per household, something like that. That's sort of meaningful to me. And getting to the specifics of 01 for the solar exemption, I mean, I can think of a couple of suggestions that would satisfy that might satisfy my concerns. One would be, it doesn't say that the solar panels have to cover any percentage or even substantially cover the closed or inactive areas. So if we would at least add that, that would be helpful. And I guess that would be after the word arrays, solar panels arrays, over, substantially covering the closed or inactive areas, or covering some percentage that maybe you could figure out afterwards. I don't want the installation of one solar panel to give a broad exemption. And then it has a start date for installation, but it doesn't put any, you can start it and take 10 years to put it in, and you've got a blanket exemption. So I'd like to see some kind of completion date, or maybe it's a year or two later. And then lastly, if I'm really understanding this correctly, if you close it, you don't have to, and you meet the solar exemption, you don't have to do anything to measure or calculate your emissions. Is that correct? That seems like a pretty broad exemption.
That exemption is correct. Again, it's for only the smaller size landfills that are less than the 2.5 million. We feel that there's probably 2 or 3 that might be candidates in that area. And then the closure date really affects the methane generation date. So most of these have been closed for quite a while. And that's why we also have all the landfills that are over 30 years closed. We're not requesting or suggesting that you dig them up to get the minimal amount of methane that's in there. So that is why the exception is there.
So am I understanding that you're estimating that the ones that were closed for 2014, like almost 10 years ago, their emissions are going to be pretty low. We don't have to measure or calculate them.
If they were closed only 10 years ago, it really depends on the size.
2014 to 2024 is 10 years. That's where I get the 10.
The 2014 date links into the EPA's numbers. The 2024, that has more to do with the installation and funding and all, rather than the methane generation rate. So
would a landfill closed or last accepted waste on 2014, could it still have very high emissions?
It could, depending on the size.
Okay, so I'm concerned about this blanket exemption that has no requirement whatsoever for calculating or measuring anything.
If you look at what's out there, though, the inventory of the landfills, there is not one that meets the criteria that you're saying. So we also know the characteristics and the date closure and everything of the landfills as well. We have some detailed spreadsheets that we could share on that also.
And all of that will be put into our technical support document with the formal proposal of the regulation.
So can you address my 2 other concerns then? There's no completion. You have to start the project. You don't have to complete it by any time. And it doesn't say that you have to substantially cover the closed or inactive area.
The date, I would think, we just said by the time that you've gone out and gotten the funding for this program and designed it to be a benefit to the landfill, which is what they want, I wouldn't see why they would start it and stop it. But I could see that we might be able to edit it to have a must be done by date as well. And it is a valid point of, can you only put 1 panel in and qualify? Right now, I think if a lawyer was to interpret the reg, you're right, you may be able to just put in the 1. So we might have to.
You would be spending a lot of money on conduits and potentially nearby transformer upgrades. I mean, so it would, but we can check on that, and we'll check with the process and the land administration for just the process that a landfill has to go through to get approval to install panels, which is itself, pretty thorough. But we'll think about whether there are any thresholds we can consider that are generalizable, right? We wouldn't want to say the array needs to be a particular size because we're talking about landfills of very different sizes, right? But so we'll have to do more thinking on that.
But even language like substantially cover the closed or inactive area, it's open to interpretation. Maybe you can put a percentage on it, but that's the intention, right? That you've pretty much covered the closed area.
Yeah, subject to site constraints and topography and equipment in the way.
Right.
Certainly, the more panels, the better. Yeah.
But there is, you're right, approval process through the land. You do have to all landfills have to go through our land administration in order to put in those solar panels.
Just to get back to process a little bit, I'm gonna there's one more hand I have next, but a lot of times we talk about these things have to be completed by a certain time for federal grant or federal compliance. Are we in a situation with these things that we're in a rush that we couldn't do another round of modification? I know you don't want to, and I'm not saying we are or that we're recommending that. I'd just like you to talk to that a little bit.
Well, I can speak on 2 matters. One, we are currently under a federal implementation plan because of not getting the NSPS requirements which is part of what this regulation is built upon. We are trying to get out from under that and have our own state plan to address methane emissions at landfills. As many of you on the council may also be aware, that this regulation was also part of the Climate Solutions Act that was proposed last year, but was ultimately struck. From that, we do expect, if the department does not move forward with regulations and have them in place, that it could become a legislative action yet again this year. And it could have more stringent requirements placed upon landfills at that time. But we are working under the recommendations and what the department has been working on for a number of years. We have been, and this one leads to one of the questions that was raised in the chat by our council member Todd Chasen.
And I was going to turn to him next. Is now a good time, Randy?
Certainly. So just to address that, Todd had asked two questions. Are most of these landfills
If I can add, sorry, before you go to that, just a point on timeline. As we all know, the next steps here would be to propose the regulation, and then it's open for comment, right? And under the timing that we looked at earlier, it would be open for comment during the legislative session. So the state can sort of move on both processes. And since we're open for comment, depending on what comments we receive, we can always amend at that point too. So we wouldn't necessarily have to pull it back now and amend and wait. We can also open it, follow the process to open it more broadly to the public for more input.
Chris, but we just want to give you our best recommendation as a council, and I wasn't suggesting we're suggesting that at this time. I just wanted to know the urgency and wanted to get a sense of that. So sorry if I look like I was pushing it a direction. Todd, can you go over your questions?
Sure. Thank you, John. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
We can.
Okay, and I think Randy was going to answer these questions, and I'm going to ask him in a way that tries to move us along quickly rather than being open-ended. The first one is to confirm most of these landfills are owned by municipalities, and most of these costs are going to be borne by the residents living in those municipalities, correct?
Correct.
And are you able to comment, are there any states that have moved more strictly on this type of regulation, either already enacted or that they are considering now?
Yeah, yes, Todd. In fact, California had the most aggressive landfill regulation for some time. More recently, the state of Oregon has come out with regulations, and the department did closely examine those regulations. And quite frankly, our regulations are in some part built upon what is going on there. And also the state of Washington is having actions put through via legislation as well. And there are other states in the Northeast considering landfill regulations as we speak.
Are any of those materially stricter than what we're looking at here today?
Well,
I would say they're equivalent.
Oregon in some ways could be considered somewhat stricter, but there's a dramatic difference in the geography and everything else that goes behind a landfill out in that part of the country and in our region. So temperature, moisture, there are so many factors that come into play with this. So it's just important to note, these distinctions. Not all landfills are born alike.
So it's safe to say that if we were to recommend acceptance of this and they went through the regulatory process and were enacted, Maryland would be among the strictest states in the country on this issue, yes?
Correct.
Thank you. Just one quick point, John, to the council members. A great deal of my practice actually involves solar permitting. I'd be very cautious about recommending any changes to these regulations to avoid the outside chance that someone tries to evade regulation by putting up a single solar panel, because I think what you'll end up with is making it that much more difficult to permit solar on landfills, and I can assure you it's already fairly difficult to do. Thank you, John.
Thank you. I'm going to go to one more process point. I don't see any other hands. I haven't seen one for a while from council members. I'm not excluding you, but maybe now if there's anybody in the public that has a direct affiliation with a landfill or an indirect affiliation with a landfill to speak. Does anyone disagree with going to that part of the comment period? Has anyone signed up to do that, Randy or Carolyn?
For this topic, I do not believe we had anyone sign up in advance.
So then that just was a public participation process that didn't take too much time. Thank you. And we had some good input from Mr.
I
Young,
think
who
I saw somebody in the, I think Lindsay in the chat asked for an opportunity to comment.
I believe that was on another topic, Dr.
I had
Lapshaw.
Ann Haveman, I think is how I'm pronouncing it correctly, just asked the comment.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
Yes.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, I am. I'm with the Chesapeake Climate Action Network. I'm not necessarily with the county, but we have been engaged in this process for a very long time. And I just want to thank MDE for its work on these regulations first. We're very glad to see it come up for AQCAC today. CCAN is supportive of this rule, and my main point today is to encourage the council and MDE to move forward quickly. As has been mentioned, MDE held its first stakeholder meeting on this issue in 2017, so 5 years ago, and has had multiple meetings since then on this specific issue. As you've heard, municipal solid waste landfills are the largest source of methane emissions in Maryland by far, and the General Assembly just set an ambitious goal of reducing methane emissions 60% by 2031, and we can't get there without addressing this major methane source. I will also say this regulation is popular. CCAN is a member organization, and our members alone submitted nearly 1,200 comments in support of the rule last year. We also met with county officials. Since counties own most of the landfills, we thought it was important to show them how supportive their constituents are of this rule, even if it comes with a price tag. So we have met last year alone with Howard, Anne Arundel, Charles, Baltimore, and Frederick counties to show them that their constituents support a rule like this. As I've mentioned, we're supportive of these landfill methane regulations. We're also supportive of putting solar panels on landfills. We're glad to see MDE recognize that the two can coexist, can and should coexist, and we're interested in making sure that the regulations remain as strong as possible and the exemptions as narrow as possible, while also allowing counties to move forward with their laudable goals of putting solar on landfills. Finally, the General Assembly requires agencies, as Mark mentioned, I think at the beginning, to use the global warming potential of methane over 20 years. I noticed in the fact sheet that there was a reference to over 25 and 28. So for consistency with the Climate Solutions Now Act, I just encourage MDE to look at the global warming potential of methane over the 20-year period. So really, I want to thank MDE for all of its work. We strongly encourage the council and MDE to move forward with these rules quickly. MDE, in addition to all the other urgency that has been brought up here, MDE is in the process of writing major rules dealing with methane emission or climate emissions from buildings. It's time, after 5 years of working on this, to wrap this one up and, continue to reduce our climate emissions. So thank you, everybody.
No, thanks for being on this call today. Excellent comments. There's someone else. Can someone else help me who's on the chat that just asked to speak?
Lewis on the IP.
I can't switch screens too easily, and I'm worried I'll disconnect myself.
I thought Ruth White.
And Haley
Yes.
Lewis.
And Haley Lewis.
Yes, I'm Ruth White from Howard County Climate Action in Howard County, Maryland. I just wanted to reinforce support for what Ann Haveman just said. We have also tuned into the regulation process that's been going on for several years. I know that there's been meetings with Howard County to discuss this. We've been asking people in our Howard County Climate Action newsletter to sign petitions that we've submitted, that CCAN has submitted So a number of residents here are concerned about that and really want to see these regulations as strong as possible. We're very concerned about methane emissions. We were tracking and supporting the Climate Solutions Now Act. And this is an important part of meeting Maryland's climate goals.
Thank you so much. Thanks for being on the call today. Haley Lewis.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Very well.
Okay, thank you. My name is Haley Lewis, and I'm an attorney with the Environmental Integrity Project. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. EIP considers this to be an extremely important regulation, and we have been involved in submitting comments on the technical aspects of the rule. My colleague, Leah Kelly, has been the lead on this work for a while, and she's unable to be here today because she has a scheduling conflict. So I will be commenting for her, but she is definitely sorry to miss this. I want to thank MDE for the hard work that has gone into this complicated and critically important regulation. Although the EPA issued federal rules relatively recently for landfill emissions, those rules fall woefully short of establishing meaningful standards for this sector. Methane's potency as a greenhouse gas demands meaningful action now. And other states, like y'all have mentioned, including California, Oregon, and Washington, have recognized that by going beyond the minimum and inadequate rules issued by EPA, and in Maryland, where landfills are by far the largest sources of methane, it's particularly important to follow the lead of these other states. We appreciate that Maryland's draft rule largely follows the approach set in California for their landfill methane regulations. And even though those rules were issued over a decade ago, they're still more protective of the climate than what EPA's rules are. However, we also urge MDE to strengthen the draft rule by following California's approach to the alternative compliance standards in Section 8 on page 10 of the draft rule. While California does allow alternatives if approved by the agency must also deny these rules and these requests unless the requisite determinations of equivalent effectiveness are shown. MDE should revise its rules to require denial unless the necessary information is shown. Again, thank you so much to the MDE staff for this important step toward making Maryland a climate leader.
Just one quick point. Thank you so much for commenting. If you have that specific amendment or suggestion, is there any way you could send that to MDE staff to make it easier for them?
Sure.
And you may have already done it, but just as a point. That's all the hands I have. Any other hands out there? Larry, go ahead.
Yeah, just, I mean, I'd be prepared to vote for it, but I really would like to hear, we've done this before in the past, where we've kind of given the department a task to come back and possibly make a revision along the lines of my three concerns about narrowing the solar exemption. One, that there be some sort of, at least consider some sort of emissions criterion, or give us a reason why that's impractical. Some coverage criterion. You know, maybe there's a way to do it that doesn't create concerns for that Todd raised about making it more complicated, but it certainly ought to be somewhat comprehensive. And by the way, you know, I know that counties own these, but there's always the possibility for privatization of things, and somebody might want to take a cost-cutting measure. So that's my reason for wanting to narrow it. And also, you know, with intention to complete by a reasonable date. So would the department be willing to take those on? And is the rest of the council okay with asking the department to take that on?
Well, when we get to the process, we can amend. You know, we can suggest that as part of our action. I see Mr. Coombe.
Yeah, thank you, John. I'll just make one comment. My firm, EA Engineering, has been working for many of the landfills in the state on various issues, design, landfill gas control for many decades, and we're also involved in permitting closed landfill cells to accommodate solar panels. And we've looked very hard at this regulation and consider it to be an excellent compromise, an excellent way to meet the objectives of managing this short-lived climate pollutant, methane, in Maryland, and an important one. But I think everybody's comments about where there are gaps in the regulation are very valid comments, but I think it's really a very solid compromise, and we have had only very limited comments back to MDE about it. Thanks, John.
Sure, good comments. Ms. Latchall, please.
Hi, it's Dr. Latchall.
Oh, I'm sorry. I
That's
just
okay.
read what's on the screen. I apologize.
No worries. I don't put it up there. I try not to be that way. So my doctorate is in public health, so I'm not as up on all these terms and everything. But I'm really curious if how are we going to double check that the reporting is accurate? I mean, do we just trust, or how does MDE enforce this?
I think, Dr. Lashow, you were asking about that surface testing, particularly because that is the where we're getting the indication of methane generation. But for all the steps, some landfills do use their own staff. Others use a consulting firm. Most likely, SCS is a firm that does the design, and then, although there could be others that do the testing. There's very specific training and requirements for those that go out there and do the tests, but we do have our compliance engineers on site, and we receive the reports quarterly, annually, whatever is the requirement, so we can do QC that way. We're out in the fields, and as others have discussed, we too have been talking to a lot of the facilities about other detection methods and things that might QC what we know about these surface emission methods. So I wanted to just reiterate, we do have a placeholder in the reg that says, should some emerging technology come about that we all agree is better, it can get added in as an alternative compliance method. We would utilize that. So, and I think through the federal has very specific requirements on QCing the equipment itself as well. So all the procedures have to be followed.
Yeah, I was just thinking a lot of research that I've seen has shown that like satellite measurements have actually demonstrated that methane emissions are greater than what's reported. So I thought that might be one way that MDE could measure it. I know that's not that wouldn't be part of the regulation itself. It's just something that was on my mind. Thanks.
Ross, I see you have some input to this since I know this is your expertise.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really great comment. And, Brown Station is the poster child for this because we do aircraft surveys, which have shown considerable leakage of methane from Brown Station. Yet, as far as I know, when folks do the in-person walkthrough of Brown Station, they seem to be in compliance. So we have historically had a mismatch for Brown Station in Prince George's County, where I live, where the waste from my home goes. I want to also add, for the record, there were some comments in chat about diversion of organic matter from the landfill, and I know that's not what we're talking about today, but for the record, moving forward on that is hugely important. We compost in the town of University Park, a citizen-led effort. So, the more we can compost even with this in place, the better it will be for reducing future emissions of methane. Brown Station really should be one of the landfills we really look at hard, and what Dr. Latchall just mentioned. I would love to see the survey records from Brown Station and how they compare with aircraft surveys, because we do seem to have a mismatch there. And Tad knows all about this. We've talked about this for many years, but we just need to be sure that this survey walkthrough is really capturing the leakage that may be occurring, and if not, we need to tighten it up. So I view what we're going to vote on soon as a first step, not the end.
And I definitely agree. If I could just chime in, and we've been working with Dr. Dickerson, Dr. Salowich for years on the question of how we can better measure methane. And for context, we updated our inventory methodology, our statewide methane inventory methodology for landfills last year. And when we did that, it substantially increased it, thanks to, in particular, research by EIP, to the point where our statewide numbers are now higher than what the aircraft measurements had been implying statewide before. So, and then this regulation, of course, much of its point is more specific measurement at the landfill so that we continue to build our understanding of just how much methane is coming from these. And the new satellites that are coming up with better spatial resolution may be really promising areas, but since those aren't available yet, that's why we built in the provisions for alternative compliance and using emerging technology that becomes available and effective. So really, really appreciate those comments, and that's definitely a direction we need to keep moving in implementing the regulation.
And just because we have allotted about this much time on the agenda for this, I want to move us towards an action. If people will go bear with me on that, can I get a sense of if someone's willing to make a motion to take a vote on this?
I'd be happy to do so. I move that we approve the motion as presented. That's the first thing, Larry, with all due respect, I'd like to just see that we approve it as presented, and then maybe we would talk about your suggestions after that, which we could amend to it. But
okay, so we have a second to approve as presented.
I'll second that, John.
All right, thank you. Now we'll do the discussion. Is there a strong interest in trying to add recommendations to that motion?
Well,
I appreciated the public comment about amending, I think it was Haley. I don't know, can we get, did you send that language in, Haley, or can you put that in the chat?
Do you mean the section 0.08 with the alternative compliance?
Yes.
Yeah. I've not sent it yet, but I will be happy to put it in the chat right now, and then I will also send it to MTE.
And I'll wait while she does that and maybe possibly amend.
Thank you. Good suggestion. Nice patience too, Larry. I see your hand up, and you had the most suggestions for a minute.
Yeah, I don't know if it's an amendment or what, that the department try to address making the solar exemption, as narrow as appropriate by addressing three things. Some sort of emissions criterion, some sort of complete coverage to the extent practical of the closed area, and some sort of reasonable completion date, not just a start date.
And the wording of that would be in the amended language, including a recommendation to address make the solar exemption as narrow as possible with those three caveats. Is that the kind of language you're suggesting?
Something like that, yeah. I mean, if they say what's, or some reason why it's completely impossible or impractical, but I haven't heard that yet.
I agree with Larry. I agree with Larry about the completion time. I think it's important not to leave it open-ended.
And remember, we're recommending that they address as we deal with the major motion. This is an amendment to the motion to pass it as is. We're going to take this thing. I guess it goes back to Dr. Salowich, if you're willing to accept something like those three caveats on solar narrowing as friendly amendments to your motion.
Yes, I am. And I wanted to say, Larry, before you started speaking, I had the same thought you did, like, oh, could they just put up a couple solar panels? But as the conversation evolved, and, I heard John weigh in that what his company's doing, and then that this other MDE agency has to approve it. I mean, I'm not the most trustworthy person in the world in terms of, trusting others. I'm very trustworthy myself.
I was laughing.
But yeah, exactly. But I don't think it's likely that we're going to have a rogue actor here. But on the other hand, if our document is used, I'm torn, because if our document's used as a model for other states where maybe there's not such goodwill and such great relationships between industry and policy as do exist, in my opinion, in the state of Maryland. So I don't know what that language would be like. Maybe Chris or somebody else, what's that other MDE agency that has to approve the solar? It's like land something?
It's
And
the land
management administration.
Yeah, so maybe like if that language could even be in there, because the land administration wouldn't approve 2 solar panels, right? I mean, like the land, like it has to be blessed by somebody. You could either try to put some narrow language, some very specific language, cover a substantial portion completed by a certain date, or you could just give it to the land administration that it has to be not just solar, but solar they approve, and just trust them to do the right thing. Anyway, I do take the friendly amendment.
Thank you. And we'll work on the wording that pleases everyone in a moment. I just want to get that. Dr. Latchell, are you ready on your amendment yet?
No, I didn't see anything in the chat from Haley yet.
No, we're not rushing her. Haley, no rush. I just wanted to make sure. Are there other people that have?
Now I do. I'm sorry.
Okay.
So alternative compliance standards in section 0.08 on page 10. So if we can maybe go to that page 10 of the draft rule, whoever's
And what
sharing
I'm doing
your
is I'm
screen.
going to see if we can add this as a friendly amendment also, and then we'll come back and work on the wording.
Perfect, exactly.
If you're looking at me, yes.
Randy, I think that's 08, I mean 05 you have up. I think we're looking under 08, the alternative compliance.
On page 10, I think.
And Eddie, I thought that we had some sentence in here like this, and maybe Eddie remembers where it is. I do understand the premise of what you're asking, to say, you know, you can have an alternative compliance, but it has to meet up to the minimum requirements of what's in said reg.
It says in A or B2, the proposed alternative compliance option provides an equivalent level of methane emission control as compared to the controls that would have been required under 05, 9, and 11.
Then under C, it says the department may approve.
Oh.
Yeah.
That alternative.
An equivalent level of methane emission control, the end of the sentence, that doesn't cover it?
I approve any, as long as. So what they're suggesting is must deny the alternative compliance request unless it demonstrates equivalent effectiveness.
I see.
In other words, it's stronger.
Well, just one thing, we as an issue, the department does not regulate itself. So we would never write anything that says the department must or shall.
I mean, to me, it's implicit in C. They may approve it if it meets the criterion at the end of the sentence.
But they can't. I agree with you, Larry.
But they may not.
Right. So if they don't approve the alternate, then you're back to the standard compliance method.
Okay. That makes sense to me.
I mean, they may approve it only. I mean, it says as long as, which is basically only.
Yeah, that's true.
I think we're covered on that. Any other friendly amendments that people have thought of that they want to include in the original motion? Oh, go ahead. I see Tom. The little pictures are so tiny. I'm so sorry I didn't see you if you were up a long time.
I might suggest, because I understand the point being made, that as long as doesn't sound like the most technical legal terminology. Maybe you should say if it is demonstrated, convincingly or by yeah, clear and convincing evidence or something to that effect. But I'm not sure as long as is a good phrase to put in there.
How about only if?
That works.
I
Todd
like
Chapin,
that.
our lawyer, come on, pipe in.
Good suggestion.
That was all.
All
Thank
right,
you.
is that a friendly amendment that you could accept, Ross?
Yes.
Okay, does anyone have additional friendly amendments that we're going to try to add on to the original motion? I can't see only but a few, so speak up if you're a council member and you have something else and you're not, picture's not showing. Thank you. So I'm going to need help. Is someone at MD able to repeat back the motion for me, and with the 3 friendly amendments or 2 friendly amendments, the one has 3 parts? Motion on the table is to approve as presented with recommendation that MDE address the solar provisions, making them as narrow as possible, to consider emissions coverage and a reasonable compliance rate, and adding the language we just said for this section on the screen. Can someone capture that in writing and send it? If it's too much.
Yeah,
I have here my own drafts. I don't, you want it written in the chat or?
That would be great, or you could read it and we'll approve it as you read it. And that's probably easier.
I don't think I have it summarized any more than what
About,
you were
I got
saying.
through the first part. Was that okay? The part of Larry's recommendations? Larry, did I capture it?
The recommend they consider an emissions criterion also for solar. I didn't hear that. Maybe I missed it.
Okay, so I'll try to the motion on the table is to pass the regulation as presented with a recommendation to address solar installation and make that as narrow as possible, to include an emission criteria, coverage, and reasonable completion date. Does that do it?
Yes, that does it for the solar part, and then the other
Thank
part.
you. And then what's, Dr. Latchall, can you paraphrase yours? And
I forget who suggested it. The department may approve any alternative compliance option. We got rid of as long as. Maybe it was if.
Only
if.
Only if.
Yeah.
So the second part of that proposal is replace as long as only if. Is everyone clear on what the vote on the table is going to be about?
So the one part that's a little confusing to me was the first part of the solar. So I understand the solar has to cover like a substantial amount of the land and has to have a completion date. But what is this emissions compliance?
Emissions criteria is what how we phrased it. But Larry, do you want to explain?
Sure. So Ross, I asked the question, if it's closed in 2014, is it guaranteed that it has low emissions? And the answer I heard was no. It still could have high emissions. So for the solar exemption, ought to have, our recommendation would be it should have something to confirm that the emissions are low before you exempt it from all of the requirements of the subtitle.
Gotcha. Thank you.
So it's been accepted as a friendly amendment. We have a second. Can you re-second, John Kuhn? All right. Any further discussion before I move to a vote? And then Carol, if you do me a favor and send this out shortly after the meeting so everyone understands, I think we're fine. Everyone understands it. They've already said it was okay. So we're okay with that, but just so we have it documented, sooner is better than later so that we have a clear understanding of what we voted on. All in favor of passing the motion?
Aye.
Aye.
Anybody that disagrees?
Aye.
All right, that's only one I heard. Is that Mr. Young?
I said aye. This is,
Yeah, I got you, Dr. Amir. How are you? But that we had, after that, we were voting the nays, and we had, I think Mr. Young was the only.
That is correct.
Are there any abstentions? So I don't have the total numbers on because I don't have the phone call people on. Could you repeat back the number for us if someone has access to who all's on the phone?
2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Yeah, I have 13 members, Randy, and that includes.
Todd Chasen unfortunately dropped off, I believe.
That's okay. We still have a quorum.
Right, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. We have 11 affirmative and 1 nay.
All right, thank you, everyone. I know that was a slog to get through, but I think it's all our intent to be supportive as best we can. I like to keep these agendas pretty much on time. Anyone that stays after 11:30, that's for your own interest. We're going to be done by 11:30. We're going to have this background on VEEP. Is there an action item out of the VEEP background that we need to worry with? I just want people to know in case they want to volunteer extra time after 11:30.
This is a briefing portion of the.
And what's the main point of the briefing?
To bring the council up to speed on the VEEP regulations that were proposed before the council. It's June 2021. And so it's just the progress that is taken to get to the formal.
And then can you do a pretty good job in 5 minutes and then go into more detail after 5 minutes?
I will leave that to our esteemed mobile program.
I know they're really great. I hate to give you the squeeze, but I just want to be respectful of the people's time.
It's 3 slides, so I believe they should get through quick.
All right, let's go.
This is Megan Ulrich. I'm the Assistant Director of the Air and Radiation Administration. Hello, everyone. We can definitely get through this in 5 minutes. As Randy said, this is just a briefing. We brought this action item to you in June of 2021. Since then, upon further review, we made some changes before we proposed the regulations. So we just wanted to come back to you and talk through those changes and let you know the schedule that these regulations are on. And on that note, I will turn it to Daniel Newell from our Mobile Sources Control Program.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Okay.
Wonderful.
Okay, great. I'm Daniel Newell. I'm an engineer with the Vehicle Emissions Inspection Program. So for some quick background, in June 2021, AQCAC approved the proposed regulations that would complete our VEEP modernization efforts that began in 2018. The emissions impact of these changes was negligible. The key regulation changes as presented were delaying the initial testing for new vehicles for an additional 3 years, moving to OBD only testing by eliminating the idle test for heavy duty vehicles, and creating motorist assistance centers to help motorists in receiving effective diagnostics and repairs. So since June 2021, we've made a modification to the regulations. So what's the same? We are still going to delay the test date for new vehicles by 3 years. We're still including motorist assistance centers in this regulation, and the impact of these changes continues to be negligible. The main thing that has changed is that the idle test for heavy duty vehicles is going to remain in the program. The proposed program will continue with both OBD and idle testing. And here is our regulation adoption schedule so far. On the 9th, on September 9th, we had our NPA. On the 23rd, we reprinted it in the Maryland Register. And on October 11th, we had our public hearing. So with that,
Any
I can hand it
questions
back.
on the VEEP? What good
Yeah.
progress?
So can you go back one slide?
Sure.
So the only difference is the heavy duty vehicles is going to remain. Why is that?
We had some legal advice that resulted in us deciding to keep the idle test.
I'm happy to address it. This is Cynthia Wise. I'm the AAG Assistant Attorney General for Maryland Department of the Environment. Yeah, just by brief background, that is correct. And really, it was a statutory construction issue, and there was contradictions in the statute. We figured out, and that's why we had to go back that way.
Okay.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add some further clarification that the only class of trucks that affects is Class E trucks, and those are trucks that are between 10,000 and 26,000 pounds. What Cynthia just mentioned is that the transportation article requires us to test vehicles up to 26,000 pounds. So there's some certain, it's just to clarify, it's 0.2% of the vehicle fleet, so less than 0.5% of those Class E trucks that are older and don't have the OBD testing. So just to make sure that we're capturing that very small percentage and in compliance with the transportation article, that's why the idle test was added back in.
Thanks.
That's great. Any other questions? A really concise presentation. We still have 2 minutes left. Is there any other comment from the public before we sign off?
I have a comment. So regarding the VEEP, yeah, I'm James Wagner. I'm with a group called Plant the Light in Frederick, Maryland. Regarding the VEEP monitoring, so it occurred to me that the real issue, or one of the major issues, is vehicle miles traveled. And I know the Maryland Commission on Climate Change is addressing that and trying to reduce it. So does VEEP have a program or an incentive for vehicle owners, internal combustion engine vehicle owners, to reduce their miles? I'm thinking, for instance, the registrations that come up periodically. If owners could demonstrate that they've driven less, say, than the average, shouldn't they get a break? And wouldn't that really address a major problem? It's not just, being within certain limits, it's the cars on the road and the overall, the annual emission from those ICE vehicles.
Thanks for the question, Mr. Wagner. Any response from MD?
I guess one thing to note is that VEEP is not a greenhouse gas control program. It's for controlling criteria pollutants and ensuring that the vehicle's emissions controls are functioning correctly. That's the purpose of the VEEP inspections. So it is a little bit different in that way. And you're right that the Climate Commission is considering how we address greenhouse gases from transportation sources where mileage driven is much more relevant. It would be a challenge to incorporate something like that in this regulation, given its purpose is different.
Yeah, there used to be a test for CO2. So you're right. I had forgotten that these are just the criteria pollutants, but even those would seem to be amenable to such a consideration of vehicle miles traveled, and it would seem possible that VEEP could be the one that would monitor us. Well,
thanks, Mr. Wagner. Any other public comment?
Yes, this is Lindsay Mendelson with the Maryland Sierra Club. I did want to comment on an item relevant to this council that was discussed in June, the adoption of the Clean Cars 2 regulation. Maryland legally has to adopt this regulation as part of the 2007 law, so this needs to happen, and I would urge the council to support a swift adoption of this rule. MDE already indicated in their previous presentation to the mitigation working group that this regulation is a key policy to ensure we close the gap needed to meet the 60% targets. 23 groups also sent a letter to the governor's office encouraging swift adoption this year. Several General Assembly members also sent a letter. This has been a priority that is in the recommendations that's sent to the full commission from the mitigation working group. And based on Sierra Club's analysis using EV Ready, the adoption of the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rule would result in reducing light duty CO2 emissions 63% and PM 2.5 emissions 61% below 2021 levels in 2035. So it's really a key component of meeting our greenhouse gas targets and also reducing pollution. So would strongly encourage this council to support swift adoption, especially at the next meeting. Thank you.
Thanks, Lindsay. It looks like our chair may have frozen. John?
Uh-oh.
Have to have John Coombe take over as vice chair, if he's still with us. We're losing people.
I think he signed off.
Who's vice chair? We need a second vice chair. Thanks so much, Lindsay, for the comment. Maybe I'll just take over. Any other comments? We are 2 minutes over, so appreciate everyone's extra time.
Just a reminder that
Yes.
several of us objected. I know it's passed and it's water under the bridge. Several of us objected to the complete reliance on OBD, and that it placed too much trust in the manufacturers without any kind of independent verification. So, a reminder for the council and for the department.
Thank you for the reminder.
So
this is John Quinn. I'm sorry, I lost my internet connection, so I called in by phone. Sorry, I missed whatever's going on.
This is Ross. I know we're a few minutes over. I just would like to put forth a motion that I would like the council to approve by acclaim, thanking Tad for his amazing leadership of the Air Quality Control Advisory Council over, let's get the date, the number of years correct. I don't actually know the number. Tad, it's a large number. But I think that this should be part of our formal minutes that we'll approve next time, thanking Tad for his outstanding leadership of being air quality director and work with the council over so many years.
I second Ross. This is Cynthia, and I worked with him for 20 years, and it was such a pleasure.
Any objections? Okay, let's be sure we get that in the minutes.
Thank you all.
Okay, thank you all. I just wanted to point out that our next scheduled meeting is for December 12th. However, there's the potential that we may reach out to the council for additional meetings as needed. But we will certainly try to give sufficient timing in the event of that. But thank you all. We very much appreciate the robust process the council provides to us. And thank you all so much. We look forward to our next meeting.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Hey, take care.
Motion to adjourn.